Hey there everybody, it's Joe the Disney Guy and welcome back to another episode of Disney Guy Reviews. Today we'll be looking at Disney's second theatrical release and the movie that taught us all the wonders about wishing upon a star, Pinocchio. The Disney studios were still hard at work as the deadline approached on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, when Walt was already thinking about what his next feature could be. In September of 1937, an animator named Norman Ferguson brought Walt a copy of The Adventures of Pinocchio, a novel by Italian author Carlo Collodi. Walt immediately fell in love with the story and declared that he wanted to make it into a movie. Walt was so enthusiastic about the project that he pulled together a story crew for Pinocchio before Snow White even premiered. Whoa, time out. Let's just consider this for 1 second. Walt was already in the middle of a project that had never been done before, something that everybody said was going to fail, and something that could have bankrupted him and his entire company. Yet he still had the confidence to start planning for an encore? You know, the more I think about it, the more I wonder if Walt really was insane. Of course, as we all know, Snow White was a rousing success, but Walt still wasn't satisfied. He felt that the studio had plenty of room to improve and had learned greatly from their experiences and mistakes on Snow White. Basically, Walt wanted nothing short of perfection for his second feature film, and thanks to the success of Snow White, he now had the money to make it happen. Originally, Walt wanted Bambi to be the studio's follow-up to Snow White, but he began to fear that due to the challenge of animating realistic animal movement, that the studio just wasn't ready for the great Prince of the Forest quite yet. Instead, Walt decided to push a film that he was sure his studio knew how to do, and production on Pinocchio as Walt Disney's second feature-length animated film began. Development on Pinocchio was anything but smooth in the beginning. In Collodi's original story, Pinocchio was a very brash and unruly child, and the writers and animators tried to give Pinocchio those same qualities. They tried to base Pinocchio off of Charlie McCarthy, a popular puppet at the time who was known for his rude nature. However, 6 months into production, Walt was not happy. He said that an audience would never be able to connect with and care for such a brash character, so he stopped production, had them throw out everything, and start over. It was at this time that the crew tried to figure out how to make the Pinocchio story more endearing. That's when Walt came up with the idea of Jiminy Cricket, a sidekick and conscience for Pinocchio. The cricket character actually was in Collodi's original story, though with a bit of a different role. You see, he was actually squished almost immediately by Pinocchio for warning him about the dangers of being bad. Let's just say we would have had a much different story on our hands if Disney had gone that direction with the movie. Creating the look of the main characters was also a struggle for the animators. Pinocchio was originally drawn to look much more puppet-like, but Walt was afraid that he wasn't appealing or sympathetic enough. Finally, young animator Milt Kahn decided to try animating Pinocchio more like a little boy than a puppet, rationalizing that they could always add joints in afterwards. Walt saw this new design of Pinocchio and loved it, and the Pinocchio we know today was born. Jiminy went through a similar process. After his big soup-eating scene in Snow White was cut, animator Ward Kimball was ready to leave the Disney studios before Walt offered him the job of animation supervisor for Jiminy Cricket as compensation. Kimball's original sketches for Jiminy were much more realistic, but Walt continued to ask for a more cuter character. Finally, Kimball decided to draw what was essentially a man with an egg-shaped head. Walt chuckled when he saw the drawing, saying, "He looks like my Uncle Ed," and approved the design. The joke among the studio was that the only reason people knew that Jiminy Cricket was in fact a cricket was because they said that he was. Ever wonder where they got the name Jiminy Cricket from? Well, actually, the term Jiminy Crickets is something that people would yell out when they were scared or surprised and they didn't want to swear. In fact, the dwarfs used this exclamation in Snow White before the character of Jiminy Cricket was ever even considered.
Jiminy Crickets.
See? I'm not lying. This is real stuff. The name Jiminy Cricket was really just a play on the exclamation, Jiminy Crickets. Sound was again an integral part in the creation of Pinocchio. Lee Harleen turned out one of his most masterful and diverse scores, including all different types of music ranging from cultural to classical to jazz. Overall, Harleen composed a much more dynamic and dramatic score than he did previously for Snow White. 13 original songs were also composed for the film, with only 7 making it into the final film. Some of the deleted songs included 2 songs from Honest John and a song from the Misbehaving Boys in Pleasure Island. A quick note on Pleasure Island. Originally, Pleasure Island was to be known as Booby Land. Go on, get all of your jokes out of the way now. Laugh it up, just get it all out of your systems. Okay, we all better now? Good. The reason why the name was mercifully changed was to make it a play off of Treasure Island, which was part of the San Francisco World's Fair in 1939. Pinocchio also featured what was, at the time, the most star-studded cast ever to be assembled to voice a cartoon. As opposed to Snow White, where relative unknowns were used to voice the main characters, major stars of the stage and screen were recruited, including Walter Callett as Honest John, and Charles Judels as Stromboli and the Coachman. Christian Rubb not only voiced Geppetto, but also was the inspiration for the look of his character. The real stars, however, were the voices of Jiminy and Pinocchio. Cliff Edwards was a wildly famous star in the 30s, and he lent his famous voice to the role of Jiminy Cricket, giving the character a great deal of comic relief and contemporary dialogue. Dickie Jones was a budding child star who received the title role of Pinocchio after Walt decided that the role would be much more believable and endearing if voiced by an actual child, as opposed to an adult impersonating a child. However, the most famous name who lent his voice to Pinocchio was barely even used in the final product. Mel Blanc, the man who voiced Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, and countless other Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera characters, was actually the voice of Gideon. But when Walt decided to make Gideon a mute, all of the dialogue that Blanc recorded was deleted, except for one single hiccup. I sure hope they at least paid Mel for his time. It's hard making a realistic hiccup noise. Much of the production on Pinocchio, though, centered, as always, around animation. Once again, Gustav Tenggren was brought in to give the town his trademark European storybook feel, and the rotoscoping technique was used to give the animators a sense of the movement that they had to draw. This time around, though, Walt insisted on making Pinocchio look cinematically like any other live-action film, meaning much more complicated and creative shots needed to be animated. One of those shots was when we see Pinocchio's town. Due to the shot moving vertically as well as horizontally, the animators had to use their multiplane camera a bit more creatively than in the past. Instead of propping the camera on top of the device and only moving the scenery, they had the camera move sideways through the device while continuing to move the planes around as normal. In all, this one scene cost $48,000 to make. Remember how I told you that I was beginning to think that Walt really was insane? Well, spending $48,000 1930s on one shot of a movie is not helping his case. The real advancement, however, was seen in the emergence of the character modeling department. This crew helped make up 3D models called maquettes that the animators could use to see how a character looked from all angles. The modeling department did one better by making a real-life Pinocchio puppet for the animators to study. They even made a working cuckoo clock for the animators and a working model train to help ease the difficulty of animating Stromboli's moving wagon. They would film the train moving in stop motion and then essentially rotoscope the footage onto animation cells. Effects animation also took center stage, particularly with the climactic scene with Monstro. Months were spent on making the waves and the water crashes as realistic and dramatic as possible. Waves in the foreground would be traced and retraced, while waves in the back received less and less detail to give the ocean depth. Animator Frank Thomas once said, "The water looks so real that a person could drown in it." He wasn't kidding. On February 7th, 1940, Pinocchio premiered at the Center Theater in New York City. Despite all of the advanced technical work, it took the Disney studio a little over 2 years to produce Pinocchio, half the time that it took to produce Snow White. Clearly, Disney was getting more accustomed to working on feature films, and Pinocchio was proof that they were also getting much better at their craft.
The one and only Pinocchio!
So obviously Pinocchio is a technical masterpiece, but how good of a movie is it? Well, that kind of depends on your perspective. My main complaint with the story of Pinocchio is that it just felt a little too episodic for my taste. It seemed like every 20 minutes or so we were entering a new chapter with new villains and new problems. I just didn't feel like I got a great sense of the villains in particular, and the ever-changing dilemmas sometimes distracted you from the overarching goal, turning Pinocchio into a real boy. Some people, of course, like this episodic feel, but I myself prefer one solid story. To each their own. But as always, there was a very good reason for this. Collodi's original novel was released in serial form, so by following the basics of the story, of course Disney's film was going to feel like it was broken up into different chapters. Now, just because I'm not the biggest fan of that style of storytelling doesn't mean that Pinocchio is a bad film, or even that I didn't like it. In fact, I really enjoyed Pinocchio, but just for different reasons. This movie does a great job of drawing emotion out of you. Watching Geppetto search for Pinocchio is heartbreaking, the donkey transformation scene is legitimately scary, and there's actually a lot of funny lines and moments in the film, particularly from Jiminy.
Well, guess he won't need me anymore. What does an actor want with a conscience anyway?
I don't care what era you grew up in, that is pretty funny. But while we're on the topic of Jiminy Cricket, has there ever been a bigger case of right place, right time than him? He just happens to drop in after Pinocchio comes to life and is given the role of Pinocchio's conscience, and it certainly wasn't because he was the most moral of guys either. He wants to fight during the movie, and he certainly loves the ladies. Even the ones who aren't alive. I don't know, maybe I'm just being too hard on the guy because I've always been jealous of the fact that he can whistle and I can't.
Give a little whistle. Give a little whistle.
Damn you, Cricket. Anyway, the reason why I complain about not getting enough sense of the villains is because I actually really liked the villains, and I wanted to see more of them. Personally, I thought Honest John was one of the most entertaining characters in the entire movie. And by the way, I know that his official name is J. Worthington Foulfellow, but come on, Honest John is just way less of a mouthful, so I'm just going to stick with that. Again though, the animation just blows me away, especially when you remember that this was released in 1940. Even little things like the sparkles on the Blue Fairy's dress or the distortion in a reflection, these weren't things that you could just put into a computer program. This all had to be hand-drawn. And speaking of the Blue Fairy, I've always been fascinated with how, despite how realistically she's animated and what really is a cartoony world, she still manages to fit in while retaining that aura of being magical. All of the animation on Pinocchio I thought was fantastic as well, especially before he comes to life. You really feel like he's a wooden puppet and not just a character who's not moving. Though, let's be honest here, he still doesn't look nearly as wooden as Keanu Reeves.
Boo!
Oh, come on, you all know it's true, that was funny. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up When You Wish Upon a Star. It's just one of those perfect Disney songs and is still one of my favorites after all these years. The song both starts and ends the film, and I can't think of a more appropriate bookend for Pinocchio. Walt demanded perfection of this film, and after watching it again, it's really hard to argue that he got anything less. Where Snow White was a rip-roaring success, Pinocchio took a little bit longer to catch on. Though the film received endless amounts of critical praise, the box office numbers just weren't there. Pinocchio cost the studio $2.28 million to make, but only made back somewhere between $1.4 and $1.9 million. Disney's distributor, RKO Pictures, lost $94,000 on the venture, and Walt was very depressed about the poor box office numbers. Much of Pinocchio's poor performance in its initial run was blamed on the European and Asian markets closing due to World War II, and as it turns out, that may have been an accurate accusation. Pinocchio was subsequently released 7 times, in 1945, 1954, 1962, 1971, 1978, 1984, and 1992, and with each re-release, Pinocchio did better and better drawing audiences in. By 1973, Pinocchio had made $13 million, and today it has a lifetime gross of $84.2 million. So I think it's safe to say that Pinocchio aged pretty well. Pinocchio has also brought in its fair share of accolades. The National Film Registry added Pinocchio in 1994, and the film won Academy Awards in 1940 for Best Song with When You Wish Upon a Star, and for Best Score. No Disney feature would repeat the task of winning both awards until Mary Poppins in 1964, and no animated feature for Disney would do it again until 1989 with The Little Mermaid. When You Wish Upon a Star would go on to have its own legacy, being named the 7th best song in a movie by the American Film Institute, and essentially becoming the theme song for Disney. Not bad for a song that was only written because there was going to be a character wishing on a star in the movie. The American Film Institute also named Pinocchio the 30th most inspiring film of all time and the 2nd best animated feature of all time. Time magazine disagreed. They listed Pinocchio as the #1 animated feature. Though, Pinocchio's greatest legacy may be in how it furthered and forever influenced the genre of animation. Maquettes are commonplace for animators these days, and some of the effects of Pinocchio were so perfect that they're still referenced even today. In fact, many of the underwater scenes were studied for a later Disney feature, The Little Mermaid, over 40 years later. It may have taken a while to get the recognition it deserves, but there's a reason why Pinocchio is still considered by many to be Disney's greatest technical masterpiece. Well guys, that about wraps it up for me this week. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them down below. And as always, make sure to check out last week's video, next week's video, and the last Disney Guy review. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next week.